Welcome back to the video, and welcome back to another episode of Rikka's Theorycrafting. Today's episode, we are going to be talking about the neutral cards that are in Shadowverse Evolve, and how you can go help add this on into some of your decks, potentially, and also how to think about main choices when utilizing deck building. So, to start off, I would like to give a definition on a neutral in this game. Basically, this is a card that can be flexed into any the classes that are currently on. This can be put in within the main 6, or it can also have its own main playstyle. Not as developed right now, but in the future we'll have good pieces to utilize in all neutral deck, but for the general instance, you can put this in any class as well. You can think of this as like Cray Elementals in Card 5 Vanguard, or any of the generic cards and vanillas added within Weiss Wars, but for the main use to think of a neutral is that it is a crossover of other playstyles and usually has some use of generic cards. Now, why is this important? Well, it's really cool that there are cards that specifically target towards being this can be put in any class, and it depends on how you want to go perceive when you utilize and decide to put them in for deck building. So the main thing I would like to go over is just 3 main tips on how to play with neutrals and potentially add them to help push yourselves within your deck. To start off, I would say that neutrals is very good use as a tech. Basically, it's a good use for rounding out your deck, and also can be some good spots if you have anything that your main class has, but you're kind of thinking, I don't want to probably stretch just an entire set of my class. I can try to go towards what the neutrals has that we can discover. A few good examples that are given here is, of course, an iconic card, Path to Purgatory. This has a fanfare, draw 3 cards, deal 3 damage to your leader, and at the start of your end phase, if your leader has 6 or less health, you can rest it and then put this card into the cemetery, deal 6 damage to each enemy follower on the field. So you see a lot of different playstyles within Path to Purgatory. You see the main draw usage too, if you're trying to be a good amount of draw, like Runecraft, for example. Deal 3 damage to your leader, that's great use of Sanguine, and also great within Abysscraft too as well. It really feels like a thorough Abysscraft card, especially with the aesthetics. But also has some elements of Havencraft Amulet. So this is a kind of a very good use of a design for talking about how usually the standard is for the designs of neutrals. Very nicely flexed, and you can put this in within any class. There are some areas that you could consider to put Path to Purgatory in. I know as a Forestcraft main, I've seen people add some PDP, but there's also a lot of different other classes that like to use this, mainly for the draw 3 cards, but also the main pressure of having a 6 or less usage helps put some pressure on the opponent. So that's something that a lot of people like to use in as their techs. I personally don't have it in some of my decks, but overall I see like the nice concept of this being added into not just one class, but a lot of different ones throughout the board. Another good example within rounding out your deck is some of the generic cards that are added within the starter decks, which include stuff like Angelic Barrage and Angelic Snipe. If you all saw my Rhinoceros video, this is very normal about how me talking about using some of the angelic spell cards is really good, because it's a nice, good, quick, cheap cost, and it's also very dependent on your scenario. Sometimes people like Barrage over Snipe or Snipe over Barrage. I personally prefer Snipe overall, but again, it depends on what type of deck you are utilizing. And I think that Barrage is good for a nice different feel, but it depends on what you fancy and what you can also do within your space as added in within your deck. Last, to go over a few other cards here, I'd like to give a quick shout out to Gilgamesh. Not many people are playing this actually, but for me, in testing Swordcraft, more so the aggressive Swordcraft, I like having this as a thorough backup piece. I don't like to have this super high because there are other better cards that are main priority within Swordcraft, but I actually like having this apart with Royal Banner because if it gets super late in the game and I just have this as like an extra piece, I usually have this as like a 1 or 2 of, then this could be a potentially impactful card coming out of the gate. And then the last thing I want to do with some main examples within the first point is bring up a card called Trail Light. This is actually a really good card within Runecraft Spell Chain, because if you are overhand around, let's say 8, and you use this to discard, you could you have to go proc this skill, which is when this card is discarded, draw a card. Also on play you can draw a card, but that doesn't matter. That's a bit irrelevant within this example. Within this, you can discard this card, you'll draw a card, you'll still be at 8, and you can discard it again. I always tell people this is a really nice card to run in Runecraft, just because you can kind of cheat out a lot of your spells into the waiting room, especially some spells that are thoroughly irrelevant. So these are some examples of some pretty nice neutrals to use overall, and with the amount of neutrals that are within starter decks and also the booster set, it's really good for nice use of tech adding into the deck. So the next point I want to go bring up is that this is also, the neutrals are also really good within throwing in an engine. Now what I mean by that is that there are some specific cards that work really well to have their own archetype, but more so like a sub-archetype, not like a full-fledged archetype. For example, the main use of this is, of course, Flame and Glass. This one is a cost 10, very expensive, has a Storm, and then on strike, deal 3 damage to each enemy follower on the field. If there's a Harness Flame, Harness Glass in your cemetery, you can deal 7 damage instead. So this is a really good card in terms of I want to go thoroughly damage my board too, despite it being massively expensive. But it's a nice use piece that I've seen people implement the Flaming Glass scenario, but these are more so the use of more late game decks and such. And of course, to go within this, with the Flaming Glass name, we have Harness Flame and Harness Glass. This one over here is basically pay 1, put this card, and add a Harness Glass on your field into your cemetery, and then search the deck for Flaming Glass and put it onto your field. So you can kind of like nicely cheat this out, funnily enough. And then you have over here the Harness Glass. You draw a card, put a card from your hand onto the bottom of your deck. So this is a nice engine that I've seen people like to use. Flaming Glass isn't as standing out at the moment, but some people have been really testing it. We've seen some funny results all throughout the field, and it's a nice thing to consider when you're deck building is, can I throw in a potential engine to add in Flaming Glass? Or for other stuff in the future for neutral support, are there engines that possibly could be added to make sure it's more like a sub-archetype, unless it really wants to be like a full archetype, for example. So that's another tip to definitely consider when deck building. The last tip I want to give is filling up your Evolve deck. This basically helps reflect back on your class and making sure to see like, okay, I have basically all I need in my Evolve deck, or do I still need a bit more added onto it? A perfect example is, of course, the person on that playmat you see as Lucifer. I already talked about more about the neutral, the unevolved form of Lucifer. This time I'm going to go more for the evolve side, and of course you all know that Lucifer has a free evolve, which is a no cost evolve. This one over here, for example, has Bane, and at the start of your end phase deal 4 damage to each enemy leader. This is really common in a lot of decks that are pretty much good with punching in some magic numbers. This is a good example on Dragoncraft per se. I play this card within Evolve when I want to help reach and my opponent is at 4, for example. So this is, and it's also good to like shut down too, because it will get rush and then you can just attempt in to just destroy something on the field with Bane. So what I like to do is, considering on this, is I want to see that, is my Evolve deck thoroughly full, or is there a way I can go figure out to add Lucifer within the scene? That's usually what I think of before I want to go attack into some Lucifers. I usually always have it at like a 2 to 3 on my main deck, but the Evolve deck is tricky because in some cases, like my Dragoncraft deck, it's really tough because you have stuff like Shenlong, you have stuff like Forte, Shapeshifting Mage, etc. So it's a bit hard to decide where I want to go put in. I like having personally 2 Lucifers just because there is ways I could have like magic numbers, but if I really need to go tackling some damage later on, this is a pretty good way to do it. So these are some potential thinking processes you can go about within editing your evolve deck, because the evolve deck is more tricky to implement your neutrals because you're deciding I need to go add in areas that I'm going to use impactfully for my evolve targets from the main deck. Other than that, that has been pretty much the main analysis within neutrals. To basically conclude, neutrals are a really fun openness for a lot of theory crafting, which I like to emphasize here on these videos, of course, in the title. But it's also really good to think, do I want to go add neutrals within my deck, or is my deck pretty much okay that I can just play like its entire class per se? So it's always some good thinking processes with how to utilize your neutrals and how to take advantage with them, but it's always up to your discretion. If you don't like neutrals overall, that's still perfectly fine. There's definitely more neutrals that will be coming later on, stuff like Dark Angel Olivia and such forth, which will potentially warp your decisions, and of course Bahamut coming in the next set. That's definitely going to be a lot more thinking process heading into future deck building. Other than that, enjoy all of your deck building options per se, and see if you all enjoy adding in some of your neutrals, or possibly deciding, nope, I just want to go full out my class. With that being said, thank you all for joining in, and other than that, continue to embrace the darkness, and we will see you all in the next video.